So last Friday, we talked about the microbiome, and this is a nice kind of segue from that, because one of the things we discussed was, how do we change the microbiome, or can you change the microbiome? And what implications, okay, what's going on? What implications are, my computer doesn't seem to be wanting to work. Huh. That's weird. Hold on a minute. Let's stop share, try it again. There we go. That there's all kinds of health manifestations that come from the makeup of your microbiome, right? There we go. And so one thing that's been kind of circulating for a while now is the concept of this hygiene hypothesis. And what that suggests is that in industrialized, developed countries, we've removed ourselves from being exposed to certain microbes that are beneficial to us and help drive our immune system in an appropriate fashion. And so as we get further and further away from these beneficial microbes, our immune system begins to kind of go unchecked, right? It doesn't get the proper stimulus. And so it then attacks things that it shouldn't. And then that's how we get the manifestation of autoimmune disorders. So this hygiene hypothesis is particularly relevant for children, okay? So again, once your microbiome is established, it's really hard to change that microbiome. It takes more than just eating a little bit of yogurt or taking some probiotic pills. And so, but when you're a child, you're born, you develop sterilely, and then you're born. And as that process happens, you're being essentially inoculated with all these different microbes. And so exposure to these bugs, particularly in soil and from animals and even certain worms, will protect these children from developing allergies and asthma. And that lack of the exposure will lead to those diseases. And so really the window of time when this is crucially important is from the developing fetus up until about 5 or 6 years old. Okay, because by then the microbiome has kind of plateaued in its colonization. And it wasn't always called the hygiene hypothesis. For one, at some point it was the old friends hypothesis, and now it's hygiene, and that can be confusing to some people because it's thought of as related to cleanliness, right? When we think of hygiene, we think of how clean we are, with brushing our teeth, showering regularly, and it's not that. Okay, it's not suggesting that we need to decrease our personal hygiene, that we shouldn't wash our hands before we eat, that we shouldn't bathe regularly, because that will cause these types of immune disorders. Now, that said, there are a lot of microbiologists that study the microbiome that think that we are overwashing, and that with our skin microbiome in particular, it's probably better to just focus on the places where bacteria really tend to grow and flourish. So like under your armpits and your groin, but then, scrubbing your arms and your whole body does deplete some of the healthy skin microbes that live there. It washes them away. So again, don't confuse hygiene hypothesis with with just typical daily routines that have been beneficial to preventing things like foodborne illness and disease. Because hygiene is important, right? Particularly in the elderly that have a decreased immune system because it's waning over time. And so they're going to be much more likely to catch illness through a carrier, a passive carrier, an active carrier, anything. It's important that we use hygiene to prevent the spread of antibiotic resistant strains, right? It's important that we wash our hands to prevent what we are dealing with right now, COVID-19, right? And influenza. We're coming into the flu season. What's one of the best ways to prevent getting sick? Washing your hands a lot. So there is this misnomer with the hygiene hypothesis. It's not talking about these kinds of things. It even has shown links to things other than allergies. So certain inflammatory diseases like type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, depression, cancer, all of these things have not had, really strong, firm scientific correlation, or even causation, which is slightly different than correlation. We talk about, is it correlation or causation? And that's a tipping scale sometimes. But there have been some studies to show that the distribution of multiple sclerosis negatively correlates with the helminth, the worm parasite, Trichuris trichiura. And so what does that mean? That means the distribution, the prevalence of MS is higher in areas that have lower worm parasite infestation. And the incidence, you guys remember incidence, different from prevalence, right? It's the number of new cases. Negatively, it correlates with H. pylori. Okay, so people that have MS tend to have less H. pylori. Interesting. Now, H. pylori is not necessarily a beneficial bacteria because it causes ulcers, but there seems to be suggestions that show that even though it causes ulcers in some people, it might prevent the development of things like MS. And we'll talk about the immune system in just a little bit and why we think that these kinds of other microbes are helping with that. As I mentioned, it was called originally Old Friends hypothesis, and then it kind of changed to hygiene hypothesis. But the idea is that, yes, sanitation, drinking water, not living in our garbage, not throwing our chamber pots out the window, right? Having plumbing, all of these things are beneficial. They're essential to reducing widespread disease like cholera and typhoid. However, in doing these sanitary practices, we are limiting our exposure to our old friends that have the same environmental niches. And they're old friends because these are the bugs that we've been evolving with since humans have been around. Okay? And so once upon a time, there wasn't sanitation. Drinking water, came from a stream. And so we were much more intimate with these bugs, and so much more likely to be inhabited by these bugs. And these are going to be things that are in the same environment as us, right? In the dirt, in temperate regions. They're going to be things that like to inhabit our skin, in our guts, to a certain extent in our respiratory tract, right? Not all the way down to the lungs. And also animals that we cohabitate with, our pets, our livestock. And that interestingly, organisms like viruses and worms that can establish chronic infection allowed humans to co-evolve these certain immune responses that made our immune system more robust to fight off other pathogens, but then also not get confused for lack of proper stimulus and start attacking the foods that we eat and getting food allergies and getting asthma and things like that. And so what are the mechanisms? How are these things being used? How are these things driving our overall allergic or non-allergic reactions? Well, the idea is that our body's immune response was trained for specific antigens. Remember antigens, right? Those are the things that elicit an immune response. It's from a foreign invader, right? Those antigens were from our old friends, okay? And that these old friend microbes were able, via their antigens, to elicit a strong immune response that was stronger than the immune response to things like autoantigens, okay? And autoantigens and alloantigens and things like that cause these autoimmune diseases. Okay, so it was able to, again, color our immune system with the appropriate targets. Okay, and when those targets are gone, well, then the immune system is bored, right? And it's got to go after something. And it's going to focus on these weaker immune responses because they're present. Certain competition for cytokines, right? We talked about cytokines, interleukins, tumor necrosis factors, MHC receptors, remember the major histocompatibility receptors that we talked about, and certain growth factors needed for our immune response to fight pathogens. Those things get outcompeted by these weaker antigens, okay? Because we're not bombarding our system with the appropriate targets. And then again, certain interactions that are needed with TLRs. You guys remember TLRs, toll-like receptors, particularly used in the innate immune response for things like viruses, right? When we don't give our immune response the proper signals, they don't know how to respond appropriately, okay? And so what we're doing, right, the idea behind hygiene hypothesis is that we're going against something that humans have been evolving to do for a long period of time, right? And we live in a day and age where we're going against a lot of these evolutionary selective pressures, right? That our ancestors experienced. And it's changing our biology slowly over time. Have you guys, anybody seen Wall-E? Right? If you've seen Wall-E, you know it takes place in the future, and the humans are all in their little, I don't know, hovercrafts, and they're just watching TV, and like the implication is that we're changing the way we interact with our environment, and so that has consequences. And sometimes maybe they're good consequences, maybe it's not. Maybe we're not destined to a Wall-E type phenotype. Maybe there's good consequences, right? Certainly reduced pathogens are not a bad thing, you could argue. But the idea is that over time, over the course of human evolution, there's been many different outbreaks of pathogens, right? They've been there before we were, right? They were there when we came about, and they were ready to infect us. And we've been doing this interplay with them ever since. And early human societies were small, right? They were tribal. They lived outside. They lived in the dirt. They carried their dead animals on their backs, like this picture, and they slaughtered those animals in their little cave, right? There was no go to the market and have some hermetically sealed package of meat that you then put in another plastic bag and you take it home and you don't touch it, and you wash your all that stuff. That didn't happen, right? So humans have evolved to be around microbes, and they've evolved to be around microbes that thrived in small populations, right? When humans were tribal, it wasn't a metropolitan area. It wasn't a cosmopolitan world with huge populations. So these microbes had to have high transmission rates in order to survive, because there aren't that many hosts around, right? It's a small population. And if you kill off that population, you might kill off yourself as a result. Okay. And so there's this, again, this dance between the microbes and the hosts, trying to achieve some kind of balance where the hosts don't die off completely and the microbes don't die off completely. Okay. And that shaped our immune system. Our immune system evolved to encounter this type of dance, right? And now we live in this day and age where we're not doing that dance nearly as much. Certainly in developing countries, they still have more of that interaction, but not here to the same degree. And there have been studies looking at comparative genomic sequencing, looking at the protein coding regions and the non-coding regions, right? So in your DNA, you have UTRs, right? Untranslated regions that don't necessarily code for a protein, but they have other roles. And they've shown that the genes involved in our immune system have much lower evolutionary constraint. What that means is that they are much more susceptible to changing. Okay. So these genes get frequently targeted by pathogens and co-evolve as a result. They're much more adaptable, right? There are certain genes you don't want to tweak too much in your body, right? If you tweak it too much, then it's not going to work. But our immune genes can be tweaked. Okay, and that's what they've been doing over the whole existence of our, of our species. We have been modulating our immune system in this, again, this dance or this battle with pathogens. And once you eliminate that, you're going against, thousands of years of evolution. Now, interestingly, again, helminths, or these worms, have been really highlighted as something that can combat the hygiene hypothesis. Okay. These worm infections have a unique ability to modify our immune response, modify the amount or the certain types of immune responses, the certain cytokines that get secreted that then activate other cytokines or activate other immune cells. And humans evolved in more temperate regions initially, and those temperate regions have much higher incidence of parasitic worm infections. And so this is something we've had with us the whole time. And so what these worms do is, let's do some drawing. they elicit the secretion of IL-4, IL-13, and what these things do is they activate our immune cells, our macrophages. They activate our naive T cells and drive them to a certain type, okay? Worms tend to drive T cells to T regulatory cells and T helper 2 cells, and inhibit the formation of T helper 1 cells. And that's important because T helper 2 cells are the ones involved in humoral immunity, or the formation of antibodies, whereas T1 helper cells are more involved in the actual immune response to a pathogen, a new pathogen. Okay. And so what it's showing is that these worms are driving the immune repertoire into a certain type. Okay, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit, why that's important and why that's kind of confusing and unclear based on what we know about immunology. Because if you look at immunology, let's say we have here an APC, right? What's an APC? You guys remember that's an antigen presenting cell. So it's encountered some antigen from something, and it's going to deliver that antigen to the naive T cell, which is then going to start differentiating into an initial T helper cell that is ready to split off into 2 groups, right? One is the T helper 1 cell, and the other is the T helper 2 cell. And so T helper 1 then starts secreting interferon gamma, IL-2, and these things are involved in autoimmunity. Okay. You can look at it from a diagram perspective too, if that works better, right? We have our T1 here, helps produce the inflammatory response. Interferon, remember, that's a very good antiviral agent that can then also communicate with other cells to let them know that there's a virus present. T helper 2 is going to lead to activating the B cells that make the antibodies. Okay, so that's a little quick refresher on immunology. And again, these worms are going to drive it to a more T2 system and kind of quell the T1. Any questions on that? Ring a bell from last few weeks ago? Okay. So interestingly, though, when we think about the mechanism of the hygiene hypothesis, it kind of goes counter to what I just said about the worms eliciting a T2 response, okay? Because it's thought that an insufficient activation of T1 is what leads, so an insufficient activation here leads to an overactive T2. And so that overactive T2 stimulation is going to start producing antibodies, and it's going to start producing antibodies to just anything because it's overactive. It's not just producing antibodies to the foreign invaders that are pathogenic. It's forming antibodies to things like food or things like pollen, right? That's not bad for us, really, right? Only bad for us if we have an allergy to it. And so this, again, goes counter to what we think about what worms are doing and the benefits that they have. And it also leaves out the explanation of several T1 subtypes that lead to disease. right? So if it's all just saying that, well, we're suppressing the T1 type, what about these T1 mediated immune diseases like IBD, MS, type 1 diabetes? Those are typically driven by a type 1 subtype. So bottom line is that this isn't really clearly defined and well worked out yet. Just like the microbiome is still kind of in its infancy, maybe the microbiome is in its toddler phase, hygiene hypothesis is definitely in its infancy. Okay, so, and again, you know, this isn't while it seems counterintuitive, it may just be complicated, right? You know, like biology has exceptions, and so it's not clear, cut and dried stuff, right? There have been some research that demonstrates that in patients with multiple sclerosis who have parasites, worm parasites, are going to display a type 2 immune response, not a type 1. And that's different from the MS patients that don't have these parasites. They have the typical type 1 phenotype, and that's what is driving that MS. But there really hasn't been strong studies to show that the worm parasite driving that type 2 phenotype has sufficient benefit. Okay. Not that it hasn't been used as a therapy, but the research isn't that robust yet. And this is a similar thing that we also see in patients with IBD. Okay. That there is this modulation of a type 1 to a type 2 phenotype. And that because these are diseases that are being driven by type 1, that there might be some kind of benefit. But again, the benefit is unclear. Any questions so far?
So
Okay.
are they using worms as a therapy or just a prevention?
A therapy. Well, I mean, in that context, as a therapy, they're not using it prophylactically to prevent MS and IBD, as far as I know. It's more like people with these diseases will actually have to. It's not FDA approved here, so if you want to do that, you have to go through channels outside the country, as far as I know, unless things have changed recently. You got to kind of go rogue and seek these therapies, get these worms from other countries. And I don't know if people that have a predisposition to some autoimmune diseases are taking these prophylactically. I mean, I'm sure there are people doing this, but it's not a standard of care as far as I know. Couple of other interesting kind of tidbits on the immune response, and particularly the helper cells. As we said, allergies are caused by an inappropriate immune response to harmless antigens. Okay, and that's driven by an overactive T helper 2 subtype. Bacteria and viruses, by and large, elicit a T1 subtype. And that, in turn, downregulates the T2 response. Okay. So, in some cases, it's beneficial to have bacterial and viral infections that, of course, don't cause severe sequelae or kill the host, because having those infections, again, primes the T1, which as a result dampens the T2, which keeps it under control. And so what are T1 favorable conditions? Well, if you have older siblings, large family size, right? You go to daycare from an early age. You have been infected by things, right? By bacteria and viruses. You live rurally. You're more exposed to the dirt and the dander. You have contact with animals, right? These things, by and large, favor the T1 phenotype. Okay. Now, some anti-vax people will use the hygiene hypothesis as proof of principle that you shouldn't be vaccinated because it's good to have measles, it's good to have TB, from that perspective, and that it doesn't kill very many people. But I don't think that that should be the interpretation here. I think that's misconstrued. Okay. The idea is that you really, while these different types of pathogens associate with a T1 phenotype, you can also have a T1 phenotype without getting potentially life-altering or life-ending disease. Okay. Now, if you have a type 2, if you're more likely to have an overactive type 2 and thus allergies and asthma, that's associated with high antibiotic use. The Western lifestyle that is indoors, urban, right? Poor diets, eating fast food. That's going to be indicative of a type 2. Okay, we're no longer giving our immune system the stimuli it's evolved to receive, right? And while these immune genes do have less evolutionary constraints and are more phenotypically and genotypically plastic, it takes time for them to get the message that, well, that whole influx, that whole stimulus you're used to, you're not getting anymore. You got to adapt. You got to do something different, right? So we are still, all these allergies and the asthma and the autoimmune diseases, according to this hypothesis, are coming into play because our immune system is still waiting for that early human lifestyle. Does that make sense? I don't know if it makes sense because I can't see you guys, but hopefully that makes sense. It hasn't caught up with the times, so to speak. And so when you have a poor diet, when you use a bunch of antibiotics, you're going to kill off the microbes that are training your immune system to go after the things it needs to, not the things it doesn't. Okay. This is just kind of stuff I've just said, right? But again, worms, non-pathogenic pseudo-commensal bacteria, so somewhat commensal, meaning you scratch my back, I scratch yours. Gut commensals, all of these are driving our immune response, and more importantly, the regulation of our immune response. Okay. Regulation is important. If you don't properly regulate, the T cells get out of control. And that's when you get autoimmune disease. Okay. And some of these things have been considered to be used as therapies to prevent this. But I think we're a long way off because, as I'll talk about in just a little bit, you got to be careful. You don't want the cure to contain another disease, right? That's just as bad or worse. And remember, this is a hypothesis, not a theory. And I've driven that home, the difference, right? This is a hypothesis. So everything that I'm saying here is supported by some evidence, but not multiple independent validation, okay? So the mechanistic reasons for approaching the utilization of the hygiene hypothesis are not there yet. Okay, it's growing. Every year we get more and more evidence that does seem to, shed light on this as a mechanism, but it's really it's still still needs to be ferreted out quite a bit. It's hard to define what hygiene we need to have, right? How do we measure the appropriate, just like it's hard to determine what's the ideal microbiome, the ideal probiotic, what that's going to contain in it. It's hard to know what the measures are for things like, I mean, you can look at your immune genes and what's upregulated, what's downregulated. You can look at immune cells, but it's really kind of hard to look at that on an individual basis and come up with some marker. So typically we use things like socioeconomic status, income, and diet, because those are general markers that show certain lifestyle behaviors. Okay. Diet certainly is going to show, as we've talked about on Friday, it's going to have a direct link to the type of microbes that we have dwelling inside us. Okay. And it's worth mentioning that autoimmune diseases aren't nearly as common in developing countries as they are in the industrialized countries. And when immigrants move from a developing country to a developed country, oftentimes there will be an increase in these autoimmune disorders in those immigrants over time. They will start developing asthma. They will start developing chronic inflammatory disease. Okay. And so allergy can be associated with diet and reduced microbiome diversity, which are both afflictions of living in a developed country. Some other evidence here: the use of antibiotics in the first year of life, heavy use of antibiotics has been shown to link to things like asthma and food allergies. However, it could be just that children with asthma tend to have, more other diseases in general and have to have antibiotics more frequently, right? So it's kind of like chicken and egg thing here. It's not really well defined yet. Babies born by C-section tend to have increased asthma rates. And so one hypothesis there is that they don't go through the birthing canal. They don't get that flora in the vagina that helps them stimulate their immune system. And there's been all kinds of crazy practice. So there's a study that just came out suggesting that they actually did this. They did a trial where they gave infants, they put poop from their mom in the breast milk and then fed that to the infants, thinking that it would be like the fecal transplant. It would colonize them with this good, healthy microbial diversity. Yeah, I don't know about that. And so, again, antibiotic usage reduces gut microbiota, and that has been shown to link with allergies, at least in these two countries, Estonia and Sweden. However, that hasn't been replicated in a larger cohort, so sample size is small. And so, again, all of these things, there's some evidence, but nothing concrete yet. Okay, so the hygiene hypothesis really needs a lot more work. So again, I'm not presenting this to encourage you guys to go live on a farm and roll around in the dirt, right? I am not qualified to give that recommendation. It's just these are important aspects of microbiology that I do think make sense in a lot of ways. And so it's something to at least consider, be aware of. Limitations: you can't apply this to all populations, okay? IBD is particularly relevant in people that are in affluent society, but you know, but that's kind of that, again, that's a rough correlation, and it doesn't speak to causation. Okay. There could be other compounding factors that are driving that. And so there's no mechanism to show that that's the case. The hygiene hypothesis can't really explain why allergies do occur in less affluent places, or that why they do occur in certain developing countries. All right. I mean, um, it's not like allergies only occur in developed countries, right? It's just there are these trends, and so it can't explain it all away. And so there are other things that have shown to increase asthma, like exposure to rhinovirus, which is one of the agents of common cold, other than in addition to coronavirus. So again, it's dicey in certain areas, but these are being considered for therapies, and so people are looking into changing the gut microbiome to treat or prevent allergies using probiotics, right? But as I've talked about last Friday, there's really very little to no evidence that shows that reintroducing microbes to the gut actually allows them to colonize the gut. Looking at prebiotics and synbiotics, the use of pre and probiotics, right, to drive the gut to a more healthy diversity that will then train the immune system to act appropriately. And then, actually implementing more rural pockets into these urban settings, right? Green spaces and parks, petting zoos and things like that, to try and get children that don't have exposure to these things get that in certain doses. And then using worms. Okay. And again, the worm thing is kind of weird, because again, it drives the type 2, the T helper 2 cell subtype. And we just said that that's what's kind of causing the allergies in the first place. So it's hard to say. There have been some studies to suggest that, this is beneficial, but, the problem is, what if you're treating with worms and these worms happen to be a leading cause of a neglected tropical disease, which, if you guys remembered when we talked about neglected tropical diseases, the vast majority of them are helminths, right? And so you don't want to, again, you don't want to give someone a cure that's going to cause some other disease that's worse than the initial one, right? And so one aspect that's being focused on is looking at drugs that mimic the effects of the worms without giving patients the actual worm. Okay. So that's it. That's the hygiene hypothesis. Any questions on that? No? Okay. Well, something to consider. If you have kids or you plan to have kids someday, you know, certainly my kids have hit most of those things. We've never lived on a farm or anything, but they certainly went to daycare at an early age, and my youngest has 2 older siblings, and we certainly let them get out in the dirt. And I so far don't have any kids with allergies that I know of. So of one small sample size for you, proof of concept. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, let's take a 15-minute break. Let's come back at 11:10, and we'll discuss the 2 articles that we read about the elite athlete microbiomes and the benefits of fiber. Okay, so I'll see you guys then.